Hello, everyone, and welcome to our live discussion, Safety Stand Down, the Importance of Situational Awareness, brought to you by the National Volunteer Fire Council. I'm Nathan Trauernicht, and I serve as Secretary of the International Association of Fire Chiefs, Safety, Health, and Survival Section Board of Directors. In addition, I'm also the Fire Chief at the University of California, Davis Fire Department. I'm joined today by Dr. Richard Gasaway, Steve McClintock, Ed Mund, and TJ Nedrow. Safety Stand Down, as many of you know, is a joint initiative of the NVFC, IAFC Safety, Health, and Survival Section, the National Fire Protection Association, and Fire Department Safety Officers Association. Each year, fire departments are asked to suspend all non-emergency activities during the Safety Stand Down to focus on training and education related to firefighter safety and health. This year's event takes place next week, June 19th through the 25th. And our theme for this year is Situational Awareness, the Foundation for Good Decision Making. We've taken a pretty broad topic and divided it further into 5 daily themes to highlight situational awareness during different types of incidents. As you likely know, and you're going to learn more about today, situational awareness is critical during emergency response operations, as it can help emergency responders solve problems, prevent bad outcomes, and make better decisions in high-stress environments. Today's discussion will focus on situational awareness during 3 types of incidents: EMS calls, wildland incidents, and roadway response, with the goal being to provide tips and best practices for responders and to prepare participants for next week's Safety Stand Down. But before we jump into today's discussion, I'd like to take a few minutes for our panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Rich.
Thank you, Nate, and thank you to the agencies that host the Safety Stand Down, and welcome to my fellow panelists. I'm Rich Gasaway. I served 33 years as a first responder, including 22 years as a fireground incident commander. In 2004, I went back to school and did my doctoral research in cognitive neuroscience, trying to understand how first responders make high risk, high consequence, time compressed decisions under changing conditions. And it was through that research that situational awareness came front and center and provided some lessons for me that I now share with first responders, mostly through a website that I have, and again, here for the Safety Stand Down this next coming week. So really excited to be part of it.
Rich, we're thrilled to have you. Steve, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Good morning to some, good afternoon to others. I'm Steve McClintock. I started in Wildland in 1978. I received my first red card. Me being only 35 years old, I know that it's hard to believe, but that's the way we go with our new math. I am currently the fire chief in Harbor Rural Fire Protection District in Harbor, Oregon. At current status, I'm still on a Wildland team, and I'm also a single engine air tanker manager, which I am now in Tucson, Arizona, managing aircraft. So if you hear aircraft taking off in the background, my partner's sending them out while I'm doing this. Very glad to be here. Thanks for everybody for supporting this, and thanks for everybody that put it together.
We're thrilled to have you, Steve, and thanks for all the hard work that you and your team do to help keep people safe. Ed, if you'd like to introduce yourself. Oh, I think you're muted.
I knew I was going to do that. Hi, my name is Ed Mund. Thankful for all the organization to put this together and the fellow panelists. I started my fire career in 1989 with East Olympia Fire District 6 outside Olympia, Washington. I've been a volunteer now for 33 years next month. I served nearly 20 years at East Olympia, and when I left was a captain, had been the medical services officer there for 11 years. I'm currently with Riverside Fire Authority in Centralia, Washington. I'm still with them since 2008, and I'm a director at large for the NVFC EMS and Rescue section.
We're thrilled to have you, Ed. Last but certainly not least, TJ.
Well, thank you all. Greetings from the West Coast as well. it seems that I've kind of walked traffic awareness from my beginning as a volunteer in '74 to the pre-traffic incident management that was offered at the Goodwill Games in '91 with the Washington State Department of Transportation on Interstate 5. From there, a volunteer command officer with a combination department. Let's skip ahead to my vice chair as the National Traffic Incident Management Coalition. Been the chair of the Washington TIM Coalition. And lastly, current member of the NFPA 1091 Standard for Traffic Incident Management Personnel Professional Qualifications Committee. Much to be said of my 20 years involvement with the NVFC. And lastly, thank you and thank all that has chose to join us today on this very important and I submit life-saving subject.
Great. We're so glad to have you, and really an incredible group of experts in each of their respective fields here to talk about this year's theme. Our discussion today is going to last about an hour, kind of depending on how many questions we receive and how the conversation goes. I have some questions that I've been thinking about that I want to ask just to get things started. But we're also taking questions from those of you who are joining us live. So if you do have any, please leave a comment. We'll try to answer it. And with that, we're going to kick things off with Rich, who literally wrote the book on situational awareness, the books on situational awareness. Rich, can you give us just kind of a brief general overview of situational awareness, what it is, and why it's so important for firefighters, not just during an emergency, but throughout daily life?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question. I think most responders know intuitively that situational awareness is important. And in fact, we often hear it when we're prepping for getting briefed for high-risk work. But when pressed for a definition, many responders will struggle to put it into words. So one of our goals today and next week is to be able to provide them a way to put it into words and into a process that they can apply, as you say, not only on incidents, but in the stations, driving to and from work, when they're doing home activities or riding a bicycle or a motorcycle or doing things with their family. So the definition: situational awareness is an individual's ability to perceive and to understand what's happening in the environment around them, while being mindful about how time is passing. Because as time passes, conditions change. And as conditions change, then so should our awareness. And then, in this next part, truly is the goal of situational awareness. And that is being able to accurately predict what's going to happen in the future and to be able to make those predictions in time to prevent a bad outcome. That's a long definition. So as I'm talking to responders, what I try to do is simplify it by getting it down to just the three key concepts of perception, understanding, and prediction. Now, to understand how we perceive, understand, and predict, that takes some time. And I made a video for the safety stand down that lasts about an hour that will cover the detail of how to do that. So we'll not cover that detail here, but encourage you to go back and watch that intro video as it breaks down that three-step process of perception, understanding, and prediction. But in summary form, Nate, that's what it's about.
That's a great introduction. And to your point, we do have an hour-long video that you created. It's available at www.safetystanddown.org. We'll give that web address again here in a little bit. But I really encourage people before the week of the safety stand down, before we get into the meat of this topic, to really take time to sit down and watch it and increase your understanding of what situational awareness is, because it's really going to help you as we look at each of these different incident types during the actual week. So thank you for that, Rich. And now we're actually going to take this idea, which is very global in nature, and we're going to start applying it to incident types. And I want to start off with you, Ed, if you wouldn't mind, and have you talk a little bit about the importance of situational awareness, specifically during EMS calls.
Okay, thank you. I'm happy to. What I'd like to start out with, since this is kind of the beginning of this program today, is really focus on situational awareness and when it starts, even before you run on the call. Because your ability to use good situational awareness begins long before you ever arrive on the scene. It begins by arming yourself with important background knowledge, because after all, you can't recognize dangers if you don't know what to look for. So EMS providers should know what the leading death and injury causes are, looking out for the most likely worst case scenario, if you will, and also knowing what types of injuries are the most common in your own service, which will help prevent you from injuring yourself in the same way, while watching out for your partner as well. So starting with the big picture, across America, what kills EMS responders? About 49% of all EMS provider fatalities were related to motor vehicle crashes, according to a study that National Highway Traffic Safety Administration did over a 5-year period. And while analyzing those crashes and another study looking at 20 years of ambulance crash data, most occupants in fatal crashes were unrestrained. And we find that kind of crazy that we're always talking about safety and people wearing seatbelts, and yet we're not terribly good at it ourselves. 22% of ambulance drivers killed in crashes were unbelted, and 84% of the providers in the patient compartment who were killed were unrestrained. Granted, it's much harder to be restrained in the back with doing patient care. There's also good national data on how EMS providers in the US are injured at a national level. The most recent data from 2020, reported by the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, or NIOSH, said nearly 17,000 EMS workers nationwide were injured to the extent where they were treated in US hospital emergency rooms for their injuries. And that includes both paid and volunteer responders. It's pretty well equally split between male and female responders, and ages between 25 and 44, that age range accounted for the most injuries. The number one cause, which should be no surprise, is overexertion and leading to sprains, strains, contusions, abrasions. The number two cause has historically been harmful exposures, but sadly in 2019, the number two cause became violence against responders, and it remained the number two cause in 2020. Harmful exposures and transportation incidents tied for third and fourth place, but together caused nearly 1/3 of all injuries. And I know TJ will be talking about transportation issues. But the good news is, out of all this, about 98% of EMS injuries in the field are of the treat and release variety, not anything more serious than that. So knowing that background, how do you bring this data down to your local level? Go to your agency's records. They'll tell you what dangerous and hazardous environments are the most likely to be encountered for you on shift. And go back a few years. Look for consistency and trends. Are things getting better? Things getting worse? Is there a specific type of call, a specific type of location that seems to trend more? And then prioritize your education and training to teach yourself how to heighten your own awareness, especially on those kinds of calls. Because forewarned means better awareness and less chance of injury. And most likely your records will show these primary risks for encountering hazardous materials in your service area. Are there interstate or major trucking routes? Do you have railroads or marine terminals? Industries that use or produce hazardous chemicals? Indoor swimming pools? And military installations. So under the guiding principles of scene safety, it's not an overstatement to suggest that consider every motor vehicle or industrial incident a potential hazmat scene until proven otherwise. So carry a DOT emergency response guidebook in your rig, or add the free app version to all the other apps you've put on your smartphone to help you do your job. Non-fire-based EMS responders can use online training or see if you can participate when your local fire department does their hazmat training. And knowing how to recognize potential for a hazmat incident quickly, react appropriately on scene, and protecting yourself immediately will mean the difference for you, for your partner, and your patients. Are motor vehicle accidents an issue in your agency, like they seem to be everywhere else? Again, in every fatal crash over a 20-year period studied, most occupants were not wearing seatbelts. So bringing it down to your own level here, situation awareness means monitoring yourself. NIOSH post-incident reports show fatigue can reduce focus, slow reaction time, and impaired decision-making skills. Each of these conditions lead to injuries at the very least and death at worst. So be aware of your mental and physical state. Are you getting adequate rest between shifts? Are you able to get any downtime on shift? Those are all good recommendations from NIOSH studies. Situational awareness also means monitoring each other. Keep, looking out for each other. Has everyone educated themselves on safely addressing hazardous and dangerous incidents? Is everybody always restrained when the vehicle's moving? Is one of your fellow responders struggling to cope with the job? A 10-year study of suicide in EMS that analyzed data from 26 states showed firefighters and EMTs had significantly higher proportional mortality ratios for suicide compared to the general working US population. And then learn how to watch for personality and behavioral changes in your partner and co-responders. So maintaining good situational awareness means a safer working environment for you, your partner, and your patients, better performance on the job, and what we all aspire to, going home safely.
That was a great overview of situational awareness factors and also the risk factors faced when responding to EMS calls that all feed into the decision making that helps keep us safe on the scene and even before we go to the scene. Rich, what are some of your takeaways for EMS?
Yeah, there was two things stated there that really resonated with me, and one was the not only awareness of self, but awareness of your team members. And we might get to it, or it might be in the resources later, but we actually developed 5 awarenesses, and 2 of those 5 are personal awareness and team awareness. And having awareness of your own environment and situation is one thing, but then having, as was stated, the awareness of the folks that you're working with and their abilities, limitations, identifying their stressors and being able to help them as it focuses on mental health was, I think, a really strong takeaway of that message. And then secondly was the fatigue, because it was, as it was mentioned, fatigue is one of the contributing factors. Fatigue impacts critical thinking, information processing, executive function of the brain. Fatigue is a fatigued brain can behave almost identically to one that is impaired from drugs or alcohol. It's just difficult for people to realize when they're mentally fatigued. Physical fatigue has a lot of outward manifestations, but mental fatigue can be kind of stealth. And I think it's a really important takeaway point there toward EMS, because especially those who work long hours and run a lot of calls in those long hours and don't get much rest or downtime, that fatigue can really impact their ability to process information and form and maintain their situational awareness. So solid point there.
I think a little bit about the fatigue issue, kind of like the hydration issue, which is by the time you're thirsty, it's too late. By the time you've hit that mental fatigue threshold, it's very hard from that point moving forward to have good situational awareness. So those are great points. Do either of you have some specific tips? So, I think there's probably some people watching this saying, like, what's 1 or 2 things? What's 1 or 2 tips that I can give my EMS crews that will encourage them to think about situational awareness as it applies to their role. Do you have maybe one or two thoughts from either of you?
Go ahead, Ed, and then I'll follow up.
Well, first of all, I want to kind of follow up too. What Rich was saying about fatigue is, there's two worlds here. If you're working a 24-hour shift and you're running a lot of calls, you're getting tired, and mistakes can happen, or that's when things get a little more dangerous. But also in the volunteer community, you may be up at 3 o'clock in the morning running a call, and then going back out the door at 7 o'clock to go to your day job, and then you come home and try and get some sleep, but you're up in the night going on calls again. You not only run the risk of being injured or having issues on those calls, but what about your day job? And do you think it's a big difference on your day job if you are, say, driving a hazardous material semi for a living versus sitting in an office job, or being a clerk in a store? Volunteers in particular have to especially look at not only their performance on calls, but how is it affecting their day jobs and affecting their employer, and hopefully their employers are helping them out as well. But as far as tips, and again, particularly in the volunteer, you never know when you're going to get called out. Nobody knows when they're going to get called out. Nobody knows. You kind of know how many times the tones are going to go off each day or each shift, but trying to develop a process where you can dedicate certain times in your life to taking care of yourself. That's hard to do with a job and with a family and all of the myriad different things going, but there's what, 800,000 folks, or 1.3 million firefighter EMTs in the country, figure out a way to do it every day. Come up with a way to prioritize your time and make yourself a priority to give yourself some downtime.
I have to pause for just a minute to say how important what you just said was. And it's something that many people who are drawn to the profession don't do well because they're so good at taking care of other people. And it's a fabulous point that deserves reiteration. We have to learn how to take care of ourselves, to be resilient, to be adaptable, to have good situational awareness. So thank you for bringing that up. Rich, do you have a tip or two?
Yeah, I do. For EMS responders, I would like them to think this way. When you're on a scene of a medical call, you actually have to develop two different types of situational awareness. One, situational awareness of patient and patient condition and patient treatment, and be focused on that. But there's a second awareness, and that is the bigger picture environment. And if a crew becomes fixated on the task of the patient problem, they can easily miss bigger environmental clues and indicators that they may be at risk about something that's happening around them. So as a tip or a best practice, I'd like to introduce one of the concepts used in aviation. So the two pilots on a flight deck, if something starts to go wrong on the airplane, and just think of that as your patient, something's going wrong with your patient. One of the pilots focuses on the problem, and the other pilot flies the plane. In fact, when you look at the checklist of, got an engine on fire, and they pull out the checklist out of their book, the first thing it says on the checklist is fly the plane. Now, you wouldn't think that pilots that have been flying for 20 or 30 years need to have checklist item number one say fly the plane, but it's there for a reason, and it's based on how many times both pilots have gone heads down on a technical problem and failed to actually fly the planes, failed to stay big picture. So what they do is they have one pilot fly the plane, stay big picture, while the other pilot focuses on the problem. So if we were to apply that concept to EMS, one responder, primary attention and focus should be on patient care, the problem, immediate problem to be addressed, while the other responder, or maybe there's more than two, someone needs to fly the plane. Someone needs to maintain some bigger focus of the surrounding environment, of the things that are happening on the big picture. And otherwise it's too easy for the crew to go heads down on the task level and miss maybe something environmentally that could mean harm to them, be that something on a roadway or a violent incident.
I'll use a word that I don't like to use, but needs to be used, because it kind of sounds like you're talking about complacency. And complacency in some respects is something that because we get so used to certain types of calls, right? Maybe if we run a high volume of a certain type of call, that we lose that clarity, right? And it seems like complacency is the opposite of situational awareness, correct? Where if we are intentional every day about rooting ourselves in situational awareness, it helps us avoid complacency and gives us those redundancies that you're talking about, Rich, in making sure that we always have the ability to know what's going on around us and the things that could impact our operations and us as individuals. So let's take this moment and do a little pivot. Ed, thank you so much for your insights on the EMS front. And move over to TJ. And TJ, your passion and expertise is around roadway response. So we'll love to hear your thoughts around the importance of situational awareness as it relates to emergencies in and around roadways.
Thank you. Well, first off, I want to acknowledge the profound knowledge that we just spent 15 plus 20 minutes hearing from Rich and Ed and yourself. There is much that what was said that can translate over to boots on the ground on the roadway. There is nothing that was said that you would disregard, whether preparing for the response, en route to the response, engaged in it, or returning. So rather than being redundant, I'm going to launch in a little bit different track here. And so to your first question, situational awareness should be a life and death focus. Let's think about it. Whether you're not aware or of no fault of yourself, you may not go home unless you're aware of your situation and you react accordingly. So what choice do you have but operate safely, conduct your operations, make your decisions in a safe and efficient manner? I think that one of the other big aspects, and we've already talked about the big picture environment, that includes and is extended to your response partners, whether it's understanding how dispatch is occurring. Have you actually sat in a dispatch center and worked a shift and understand the roles, understand the limitations that those dispatchers have? Know them personally, and I can guarantee you they'll have your back just a little bit better, and they'll recognize who comes on the radio at what time and where your strengths are and your weaknesses are and help you. But you need to understand your other partners, whether it's be law enforcement, towing, service patrol, DOT, EMS. And we've all probably, most of us have heard this, you don't exchange the business cards on the scene. You do it beforehand, and you understand what their level of awareness are individually. It's, again, like Rich talked about, the two pilots. It's very difficult to handle situations unless you know the person in the left or the right seat. At least you know what their capabilities are and their limitations. But for all of us, our awareness has to extend to include maintaining the safety of the traveling public and the continuity of roadway operations. It's not but one tool in how we efficiently operate on the roadways. And I would submit, as we talked about, everybody goes home. So awareness, what's some of the end game, the end goals of situational awareness as it relates to roadways? Well, the big one that I circled and raised was losses and reporting. As of a half a year, we've gone through 6 months almost, and we've lost 25 on our roadways, according to the emergency responders struck by vehicle fatality report. 6 of those were fire EMS, 11 law enforcement, 7 towing, and 1 service patrol. Unconscionable that we're dealing with that as we are. Are they predictable? Yes, they are. Are they preventable? Yes, they are. And we have to have our head on a swivel 24/7 out there. If we don't, we might be the report rather than writing the report. And I'll offer tips after this, but let's move on, I guess, and see where we go, Nathan.
Yeah, that it's an incredible point. And I think one of the real challenges, TJ, on the roadways, and correct me if I'm wrong, is it's not just about our situational awareness. You know, we have a luxury in some emergency scenarios of being able to fully control the environment around the emergency. And in roadway emergencies, we're also having to rely on situational awareness of all the other drivers that we're sharing the road with. And we know what a challenge distracted driving is. And so as people are thinking about this year's topic, situational awareness, it goes beyond us. It goes beyond our industry. You know, it really impacts everyone. And the roadway just made me think of all the challenges that we see around distracted drivers and the risks that poses for emergency responders.
Nathan?
Yeah.
Can I toss something in real quickly?
Absolutely.
Both TJ and Rich. Now, Rich was talking about borrowing something from the airline industry. I think something else that we could borrow from them that would be very helpful, particularly considering that nearly half EMS line of duty deaths are in motor vehicle crashes, is their sterile cockpit concept. When you are running to a call, and particularly if you are running code or you're transporting a patient, there's nothing else going on in the cab of that ambulance except taking care of business of getting safely down the road. And if there's 2 of you in the front, the radio's off, the music's off, you're not chit-chatting about where you're going for lunch. You are solely focused on the radio traffic coming from dispatch, other units, and the surrounding environment that you're traveling through. You're helping each other get safely down the road. The sterile cockpit concept really can make a difference.
That's a great point. And John Sullivan, who's a previous year subject matter expert from the safety stand down, dropped into the chat. We're 27 nationwide, and he brings up a good point that there's also a lot of these incidents that result in injury and death that involve backing apparatus as well. And it's definitely something for us to improve on. Rich, I'd love to hear a couple of your thoughts on it. I think one of the things that's probably resonating with people right now is your example from the airline industry. Are there examples from other industries that do situational awareness really well that you could share with us either now or maybe a little bit later on in the conversation?
Yeah, let me give a little bit of thought to that. Probably the domains that I think have spent the most time immersed in the topic are military, aviation, and medicine. And so let me ponder on that. I've got queued up a thought.
Yeah, I didn't mind to throw. I didn't mean to throw you there. But
if I get on that road, I'm going to forget.
But I think it's something where people who are new to situational awareness, the airline example is just such a good example that someone can wrap their head around and then see how that applies to us. So, but for now, tell us a little bit about your thoughts in addition on the roadway safety and
Yeah.
situational awareness piece.
I think it was a really solid point that TJ made about getting to know our response partners. In the parlance of situational awareness, we would call that creating shared awareness. Shared awareness is the opportunity or the challenge of getting multiple responders representing multiple agencies on the same page of understanding of strategic priorities and tactical objectives while working on a roadway incident. Quickly, we can see that we are going to have competing priorities. EMS priority, patient care. Fire priority, extrication and maybe fire suppression or in preparation for a fire. Police priority, traffic movement and traffic control and opening the roadway. Tow priority, get in there, get those vehicles off the roadway so that the roadway can be opened. And with these, throw in maybe a helicopter response and setting up an LZ, you put all these competing priorities into play, and each agency can get kind of caught up in the belief that their priority is the most important of all the priorities. and in reality, they're all very important priorities. They just, the different agencies have their focus and what they're wanting to accomplish. And this can create some communications and coordination challenges as everyone has their own kind of SA for their area of responsibility. So I think that was a solid point of getting to know the players in advance, and then not only getting to know them individually, but getting to know more about what their priorities are. When, say, a police officer is hounding a fire commander to get the roadway opened, understanding why, what's the priority, what problem are you trying to solve, say, upstream in the traffic flow, like a secondary event or something that might help build this mutual understanding or mutual respect of these competing priorities. The second thing I want to say about roadway incidents is you think about this for a moment. If you go into the busy downtown of a city and you walk up and down the sidewalk, there is a very low probability, although it can happen, that you will be a victim of an act of violence. In other words, let's just say you pass 1,000 people walking up and down the sidewalk. Maybe only one out of those 1,000 have the ability to harm or kill you. Let's say carrying a weapon. But on the roadway, every driver has a weapon. Every one of them. Every one of them that holds the potential to pass by our scene has the weapon that can harm or kill us. They probably don't see it as a weapon. So the challenge for us as responders, and splitting our awareness between whatever our tactical objectives are on the incident, is to be mindful that every one of those drivers holds the weapon that could harm or kill us. And to be proactively defensive toward protecting ourselves from their weapon. Now, very few, if any of them, have a malice intent to harm or kill us. It can happen that someone with malice would drive into an incident, but most of the time they do it unaware or innocently. But nonetheless, they hold that weapon, and they can harm and kill us. So I want the responders to always be thinking their mindset to be a defensive mindset toward the unintentional outcomes that can occur from the motoring public. So with that, I'll pause. And
that's a really powerful statement to pause on. a really powerful statement to pause on, Rich, and it's something that we all need to think about. It's time now to shift to the third area that we're going to cover today, and that's situational awareness in wildfire. As a fire chief in the Western United States, and as a fire chief in the state of California now for over 16 years, wildfire is changing. And with it, I think a lot of things around how we respond to and take care of ourselves and our crew also has to change given the changing dynamics. So we're now going to turn to Steve. And Steve, if you can share with us your insights on situational awareness in wildland fire.
Well, I got a pretty rough crew I got to follow. I appreciate being third. Thank you very much. I think situational awareness, I think it starts, I mean, it's such a big, broad subject. It starts from the moment you open your eyes when you're born. I would say that half the people, if you were to ask them, what color is your neighbor's house? What color car do they drive? Would they know that? I don't know. Would I know that? I'm not sure. We look at the wildland part of it, and I heard somebody say about putting apps on an iPhone. iPhone is a pet peeve of mine. I mean, you look at the way people are out on the fire lines nowadays. They're on their telephones. They're taking snapshots of airplanes dropping retardant, taking snapshots of what the fire's doing. So when they're doing all that and taking pictures and using their cell phone, where's their situational awareness? You get in a crew buggy, you put a crew in a buggy. It used to be when you're going on a fire, everybody's talking, everybody's chit-chatting. Now it's either they're on their phone, text messaging back and forth to other people. They have their headphones on, they're listening to music. So they're not really getting situational awareness. They're not communicating with their crew. They don't know their crew. You're out on the fire line, situational awareness on the fire line. You need to know your crew. You need to know the strong ones, the weak ones. And the only way you're going to find that out is by having situational awareness and know your strengths and weaknesses. Know if somebody's having a hard time. Maybe this guy's always jolly. He's always in a good mood. But today he's just not on that. Is there a problem? Is he having issues at home? You need to know, everybody needs to know each other. Communication is probably the biggest issue that you need to have, including your situational awareness. Everybody needs to communicate. We see a lot. I go back again. You see a lot of. I think that the world's changed to where we use this leash that we all carry because that's the way of the world. But we were just talking about changes. We didn't used to have cell phones. We talked on the radio. We talked back and forth. We did things even at home. You do family things. Now you sit around and you get on Facebook. You get, and I'm just as bad as anybody else. It's ridiculous how you get addicted to these things. But I think that addiction needs to go away out on the fire line. I think that we need to get back to situational awareness, what's going on, and communicate. Communication is the biggest issue, I think. Chief, in the fire service, structure fire, 9/11, what did they say? A bunch of the people died because lack of communication. They didn't talk to each other. I know the president signed a bill after that saying that everybody should have radio inoperability, right? Is that done yet? Absolutely not. It's not done. Okay. Briefings, morning briefings. You go to those briefings in the morning on a wildland fire, you need to pay attention. It's not the time to joke with your neighbor. None of that. It's time to listen to what they're telling you. What's the fire doing? Well, I can't tell you what the fire is doing because I didn't hear the weather report. Do you need a weather report? Or do you need to look around? You need to look around and see what the terrain is, see what your wind's doing. And if you see something that's different that you don't like, communicate it. You can't just, you got to communicate it, but you got to communicate it to everybody. And just because you might be just a grunt firefighter out there digging a trench and your superintendent has been in the business for 30 years, you still need to speak up. Nobody is going to get mad at you for not speaking up if you see something wrong in your situational awareness. So I'll get off my soapbox about cell phones, but it's pretty annoying when you see the bottom of airplanes dropping out retardant, and then you read about somebody got hit with retardant. They got a broken arm or a broken leg, or a tree fell out, the top of the tree fell out and got them. What were they doing? Did they have their situational awareness? I don't believe so. Speak up.
Yeah, no, those are really great points, and especially important today because the complexity of wildfire incidents, the number of partners, federal, state, local, tribal, private, who come together for these massive events, take existing situational awareness challenges that you outlined, as part of our day-to-day problems, and exacerbate it on a really grand scale. So thank you for bringing up those points. And Rich, what kind of insights do you have to add for the wildland?
Yeah, Steve made some really solid points. And I'd like to just kind of piggyback on to the challenge of paying attention. He talks about, if you have your cell phone, you can go, the term would be heads down on your technology. And one of the issues of going heads down on your technology is your technology might give you something very interesting to look at, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's important. And we can lose sight of what is important while we're being entertained by something that is interesting. And another challenge with communications is just because someone is talking doesn't mean someone else is listening. And even if someone else is listening, it doesn't mean they're understanding. And we can get fooled into thinking that if we're communicating it, someone else is getting it. Well, out there in the world, there are good communicators and not so good communicators. If you think of it this way, when you're communicating by voice, your words are painting pictures on the minds of other people. Some people are so good with their words that they paint beautiful, clear pictures of understanding. And for some people, it's like abstract art. Holy cow, they say something and you don't have clue one of what they were talking about or what they meant, because it just didn't paint a good picture. So if I could build off of that, something that Steve said about speaking up. When there's a briefing going on, and let's just say the briefing is 20 people standing around and the briefer is up on a stage and the briefer is saying something, if there's somebody in that audience who doesn't understand, there is a pretty good probability that they're not going to speak up and raise their hand among 20 people and say, I don't understand what you're saying. Because to speak up invokes fear of ridicule, consequence, being wrong, judgment. And while we might say, anybody got any questions, and nobody's hand goes up, there could be people who don't fully understand our intended meaning, but are too afraid to speak up. So they'll infer their meaning. In other words, they'll paint their own picture in their mind of what they think we meant when we said what we said. And there you begin to have the disconnect of shared awareness. So want to reiterate that value of speaking up. Chances are, and you probably heard teachers say this, if an instructor at a fire school, if one person has a question, there's probably 5 people who have a question. Somebody have the courage to raise their hand and ask the question, to speak up, or to say something doesn't seem right, feel right, look right, sound right. So I just want to reiterate that that's really important point that Steve was making about communications and speaking up.
Yeah, they really are. And these are all the examples that we've talked about today. While we're trying to relate them to specific incident types, they really are interwoven in what we do every day. Everything that each of our subject matter experts have highlighted today, while giving examples specific, are also very applicable to so many parts of not just our operations on the emergency scene, but also in our daily life. And we are starting to close down on our time together, but we do have a Q&A question from the audience, and it goes back to the original discussion that Ed and Rich were having related to EMS responders, but really it's for all first responders, and that is about fatigue. And William asks, if you're fatigued, aren't you putting others at risk?
So is that, who do you want to answer that? So
yeah, go for it, Rich.
Okay, so I think the simple and obvious answer is yes. If you're no matter what you're doing, operating in a fatigued way, you are putting others at risk, because your ability to process information, the ability to take in inputs, ability to see and understand clues and cues and make sense out of them and predict, and even just the proverbial keep your head on a swivel. You don't swivel as much when you're fatigued. Your eyes don't shift as much when you're fatigued. The challenge is, as you had noted earlier, Nate, is realizing when you are mentally fatigued. You use the hydration example, and I thought that was solid, because by the time you realize you're dehydrated, you're already way behind the curve. And oftentimes, by the time you realize you're fatigued, you've been fatigued for a while. And that can impact your ability to think and make decisions, which, as William asked the question, absolutely put yourself and others at risk.
Yeah. And Ed, do you have any additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, you're also putting others at risk, particularly if you're a more seasoned responder and you have someone with you, a partner with you with less experience, and who's relying on you and is learning from you. What kind of a example are you setting? But if you are not 100% functioning on your own, you may be relying on someone who's perhaps doesn't have your skills and experience that you do, and you may be in fact putting both of you at risk, because you're asking more than that person knows or is able to offer.
Excellent point. Excellent point. And one of the questions, I've been doing the safety stand down as the lead for the effort for a number of years now, and a question I get from everybody each year is, how do I get my department to become involved in the safety stand down? This year's situational awareness, but in my time, we've covered things like firefighter cancer, exposure, emergencies in the roadway, annual medical physicals, a whole lot of stuff. And every year people ask, how can I get my department involved? And when I get asked that, I said, if your department isn't encouraging everyone to do it, it starts with you. Yeah. Just like situational awareness, it starts with you. And so I encourage people, when I'm asked that question, be the lead for your crew, be the lead for your shift, go to the stand down website, take the opportunity to sit down and be the change that you want to see, right? And you can have an impact. Maybe this year it's at the crew level, and next year, because other people hear about what you did, it starts to shift to the battalion level, or maybe a couple companies get together, a couple volunteer agencies get together for a dinner and a presentation, right? There's all sorts of different ways people can engage in the safety stand down this year and any other year. Does anybody else have any tips as to how we can get firefighters next week to come together and engage on the topic?
I got a couple ideas. One, there's a saying that says, when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. And until the student isn't ready, the teacher is not seen as the teacher. So what I would encourage those that are frustrated with getting traction with this topic or other stand down topics is try, instead of teaching and preaching, just try asking like general, almost rhetorical type questions that don't put somebody on the spot like, aha, got you, you don't know the answer, but just questions to kind of start a conversation about the particular topic. Because if you can just ask questions that get people just kind of chatting around the coffee table, that's a lot less intimidating than trying to teach something to someone who isn't quite ready to uptake the message yet. So just consider that as a potential tool for you. Another thing is, if you're going to talk about specific concerns that you have about your department, try couching those concerns by using the same concerns, but it's happening somewhere else. Like when somebody's having trouble with their boss, I always encourage them to go to their boss and say something like, boy, my wife at work is having this problem with her boss, and her boss is doing this and her boss is doing that. All the while you're talking about the problem you're having with your boss, but you're not being as aggressive or maybe confrontational about it. So if you can find an example of something that's happened somewhere else and not put the hot spotlight on our own organization, sometimes that's enough to get, especially if something's gone wrong, it's easy for people to talk about other people and other organizations. And then you just kind of swing it around the question of like, well, how could we prevent that from happening here? You know, we don't want to be the ones that other people are sitting at their coffee table and talking about like we're talking about that department, you know, and that's just kind of two soft ways to kind of backdoor your way into these conversations.
Those are great examples, and we have just a couple minutes left, but there is another question that we'll do today, and then if people have additional questions, we'll talk about how to send those in later and get some answers. But from Kathleen P on Facebook, how do you advise someone to speak up if there's a fear of being perceived as disrespectful or disruptive to progress? Any thoughts on that from anyone in the group? Rich?
Yeah, I have a thought on that. So Kathy was the person who asked the question?
Kathleen.
Okay, so Kathleen, what I would start with doing is having a conversation with the bosses, the ones that people fear, and asking the bosses something like this. If you were making a mistake, if you were making a bad decision that was going to get someone hurt or killed, would you want someone to speak up? And I hope if their heart's in the right place, that they'd say, absolutely, I don't want to get some.
All right, everybody, we apologize. We had a technical difficulty and it shut down the whole show. So we're back. Hopefully the rest of our panelists are able to join back up with us. Hopefully we haven't lost our entire audience, but before we were abruptly disconnected, Rich, you were answering a question from Kathleen P on Facebook. And the question was about how to speak up in those instances where maybe you don't feel comfortable, or the people who are in those leadership roles, you have discomfort with speaking up in those moments when something needs to be said.
Yeah. So I'm going to kind of start over on the answer so that it's flows cohesively here. So the first thing that I would encourage to have happen is a conversation with the people who are in the leadership roles, and ask them, if you were making a bad decision that could result in someone getting hurt or killed, would you want to know about that before you implement the decision, or in time to pivot or shift from that decision to keep someone from getting hurt or killed? And I would hope with all of my heart that the boss or bosses would say, well, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I would want to know. The next step then is to ask those bosses, well, what would you want the worker to say to you? I mean, specifically, like, you cast us the script. If they came up to you with a concern, what would you want them to say? And how would you want them to say it? And then they would say, well, here's what I'd want them to say to me. Okay, worker, now we're going to practice. Walk up to the boss and say the very thing that they told you to say to them. How could the boss get mad? They're handling it exactly the way they said they would want it to be handled. So when the worker comes up to the boss, the process has already been affirmed, and it's important that the worker hear the boss affirm this process. So, because you walk up to the boss and say, you know what, if you don't stop this crap, you're going to get somebody killed right now. That kind of hostile, confrontational style is likely to make the boss feel like they're being pushed into the corner, which can cause them to push back and even stick to their decision even more aggressively. So that's not what we want to have happen. So if you want a good example of this, you talk about examples from other domains we're talking about earlier, Nate. This one also comes from aviation, and it's called the 5-step assertive statement process. So if somebody wants to visit my website, the samatters.com site, and put in 5-step assertive statement process, they'll go to a blog article where I have written about this process that they use in aviation for stating a concern. Now, everybody's trained on this, so it's not a surprise when anybody uses it. When anybody uses it, everybody knows why they're using it and what it means. And it starts with a catchphrase or a trigger phrase, something that when that phrase is used, everybody knows there's an issue. In aviation, it is simply this: I have a concern. Not very sexy, but that's what it is in aviation. I have a concern. So the first thing you do is you respectfully address the person. So if it was you, Nate, I'd say, Chief, I have a concern. So step 1, address the person respectfully. Step 2, say you have a concern. Step 3, state what that concern is. I see this happening and I'm concerned that that might not turn out well. Step 4, so that we don't just be seen as somebody who can point out problems. Step 4 is bring a solution. So step 1, respectful address. Step 2, state I have a concern. Step 3, state what the concern is. Step 4, offer an alternative solution to the problem. And then step 5 is to gain the acceptance or concurrence of the decision maker to pivot from the track they're on and go a different track. When everybody's trained on this, it's a lot easier to practice it and implement it and actually use it. It's one thing to say, speak up, speak up. It's another thing to teach somebody how to speak up, what to say, and then practice, just like we practice hose line advance, we practice evolutions in speaking up. And the more we practice it, the easier it'll get and the better that it gets. I was doing a program actually in Washington State, in Buckley, Washington, and I had this conversation with the attendees. And when I left, the program was done. The chief kept everybody there to talk about, well, what should their trigger phrase be? What should they say to let an incident commander know that there's a potential problem? And they come up with a really ingenious phrase. I'm not saying it would work for everyone, but this was theirs. And I actually did a podcast interview with the chief to talk about how they did it and why they came up with it. Here's their phrase. Okay. If I walked up to you, Nate, and you were commanding an incident, and I walked up and said, Chief, the pigs are eating lemons. That phrase begs for you to say, what does that mean? And now you're inviting me into a conversation. What does that mean? The pigs are eating lemons. What do you mean? Because it's not really telling you anything specific about my concern. It's just a phrase that can catch your attention. Because sometimes, like I said earlier, we're not always, when someone's talking and we're hearing, we're not always really listening and understanding. When you use that unique, bizarre phrase that really is gibberish, that doesn't mean anything until you put it in the context that something's going terribly wrong. The pigs are eating lemons. I have a concern, is enough to spark the conversation. Well, what is it? This is the concern that I have. Here's what I think we should be doing as a alternate solution. Can I gain your concurrence to shift or pivot to a new way of doing it? 5-step assertive statement process, and it's part of the crew resource management that is used now in aviation across all aspects: pilots, co-pilots, flight attendants, air traffic controllers, baggage handlers, gate agents. It's universal now. Now, it took a long time to get to be universal because aviation's broad spectrum, many companies. But within a department, it wouldn't. Depending on the size of the department, it could be a little bit challenging, but it's really valuable toward getting people to speak up.
Those are some great insights, Rich. And also, I think Kathleen's question raises an important point for those of us in leadership roles, which is to always encourage this kind of dialogue, to always encourage people to, using whatever process you decide to outline, but have a process and create a culture where these type of conversations and concerns can be raised. And that's the responsibility of any good leader in our industry, just fundamentally. We were out of time. We've gone over time. But I do want to remind everyone that there are a ton of resources for next week available at www.safetystandown.org. We have the introductory video that Rich graciously filmed for us to get people ready for the week. We're going to have daily intro videos from Rich for each day specific to the incident type. Our partners at Fire Rescue One are going to be doing an article each day in partnership with Rich that help people steer over to those resources. We also have a quiz that's available. That quiz is available on the Safety Stand Down website. Taking the quiz and successfully completing the quiz gets you entered to get a Safety Stand Down challenge coin for this year, and also one of Rich's books signed by him. So please take the time to do the quiz, get entered to win those items, but more importantly, use the quiz and the other materials to educate yourself and your crews about situational awareness. I want to sincerely thank all of our panelists, Dr. Rich Gasaway, Steve McClintock, Ed Mund, TJ Nedrow. You're an incredible team. This has been a great conversation. And we also want to take an opportunity to thank everybody who joined us today. We had an interesting discussion on situational awareness during response operations, and we hope that those of you who joined feel better prepared when it comes to taking part in this year's Safety Stand Down. And as a reminder, that's next week, June 19th through the 25th. And again, more information and resources available at www.safetystandown.org. I also want to thank the National Volunteer Fire Council for organizing today's discussion. The NVFC is the leading nonprofit membership association representing the interests of the volunteer fire, EMS, and rescue services. They provide resources, training, advocacy, and programs to help the volunteer emergency services thrive. You can learn more about the NVFC and what they do, as well as access all kinds of resources at www.nvfc.org. If you're not a member, I want to encourage you to join. It only costs $21 a year and comes with a variety of benefits, such as free training in the NVFC virtual classroom, access to the Volunteer Voices member community, and much more. You can learn about all of these things by going to www.nvfc.org/join. We're going to include this video's description in the links to the NVFC, IAFC, FDSOA, and NFPA, and the Safety Stand Down websites. If we didn't get a chance to answer a question, or if you weren't able to join us live today, please email the NVFC's communications coordinator, Matthew at nvfc.org. Again, thanks to the panelists. Thanks to all of you who joined us. Have a great afternoon, and we look forward to you participating next week in the Safety Stand Down. In the meantime, be well, stay safe, give each other kindness. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.